Hello, I'm once again excited to be a part of the Childhood Potential Conference. Today, let's explore the miracle of language development and also take a look at the things you can do to support your little one's ability to communicate. So much of a child's success in life depends upon the development of language. Language is a powerful tool that allows us to express emotions, thoughts, and needs. Through language, we strengthen our connections with others, we build relationships, and we navigate social interactions. Language is essential to social emotional learning and to the development of social emotional health. Successful language development during the toddler and preschool years reliably predicts later academic success, so that makes language development essential to academic development. It's easy to see that supporting language development helps children build a solid foundation. There are two kinds of language development. Receptive language is what a child understands when listening to the language of others. So, for example, a child who can point upon request or follow directions is demonstrating receptive language. Receptive language is what the child receives and understands. Expressive language is what a child can say, including words, phrases, or sentences. A child who can express their thoughts is demonstrating expressive language. The development of expressive language always lags just a little behind the development of receptive language, and that means for much of infancy and toddlerhood, children understand more than they can express. In order to speak, children must first learn, store, and understand language. They must develop their receptive language first. Dr. Montessori is credited with many innovative ideas. One of the most important is sensitive periods and the role that they play in the potential of childhood. A sensitive period is a time when neural pathways within the brain are easily formed and children are naturally focused, motivated, and at their developmental peak for mastering specific skills. Dr. Montessori noted that by taking advantage of these special times in a child's life, we can actually aid their development. She identified many sensitive periods. The longest period by far is the sensitive period for the development of language. She charted it as beginning at birth and extending to around 6 years of age. However, we now know babies can hear before they're born, so really this sensitive period begins even before birth. Babies in utero can hear sounds outside the body by about the 6th to 7th month of pregnancy, making these months the perfect time for parents to begin reading and singing to baby. You can support the development of language for your child before the child is born. Dr. Montessori understood that the acquisition of language was a very complex process. She identified several developmental milestones in her chart of the development of language found within the book The Absorbent Mind. The first milestones involve locating and focusing on sensory input, as the infant learns to locate and attend to vocal sounds while ignoring other environmental sounds, and to locate and attend to a speaker. The second milestones involve motor movements as the child learns to control breath, lips, tongue, and mouth to produce syllables and begin to babble. The third milestones involve the development of receptive language. Remember, that's what the child receives and understands. Children begin to absorb the language of their caregivers, and they eventually understand that language has meaning, and they learn to process language in ways that helps them understand that specific words have specific agreed upon meanings. The final set of milestones involve the development of spoken or expressive language. Around the age of 2, children's language explodes as they make progress in expressing their thoughts through language. The organization of this chart does make it easy to see that expressive language is dependent upon the development of the child's sensory processing system and motor development. It is receptive language that provides the cognitive basis for the development of expressive language. Dr. Montessori described it this way: At 2 years of age, we notice a sudden explosion into words. This explosion comes from the hidden work of the child. There has been a hidden, important, and complex preparation of language before this expression becomes manifest. The development of the sensory processing system makes it possible for the child to locate, attend to, and process language. This means their brains can coordinate and produce the expected response. We can observe the child's verbal or behavioral responses and then use those observations to determine learning and comprehension. Honestly, when you think about how complex this process is, the development of language seems almost miraculous. Watching baby grow, develop, and become fluent in the language or languages of caregivers demonstrates the importance of sensitive periods and the role that they play in overall development. It is easy to observe the earliest indicator of language development. That early indicator is the use of gestures. Gestures develop in predictable patterns, as outlined on this slide. How and when children use gestures reliably predicts language development 2 years later. So the development of gestures is so important. Gestural development is easy to track because it's so easy to observe. It is also easy to support. Use this chart to incorporate more gestures into your communication with the littlest people in your life. Meeting the milestone of 6 gestures by 16 months supports language, social emotional, and cognitive development. This means we need to be using gestures more so children see and repeat our use of them. Gestures increase the ability to communicate. They reduce frustration, and importantly, they build an understanding of the power of communication. This includes sign language and is the reason that a few simple signs give very young language learners a language head start. To further explore the development of gestures, see the First Words project, which I linked in the handouts. MLU, or mean length of utterance, is an important and useful measure of expressive language. MLU is simply the average length of a child's utterances, or the number of words they use when talking. This slide shows the math of figuring MLU. First, listen to a child's speech and record exactly what is said. Then add the words together and divide by the number of utterances to get the mean length of utterance, or MLU. MLU is useful for tracking children's expressive language development. This table provides some broad milestones of expressive language development. I included the major milestones of MLU development in the upper rows and the development of major grammar milestones in the lower rows. Of note, mastery of basic grammar happens after children are able to form 5 to 6 word sentences or have an MLU of 5 to 6. As with all development, there is a wide range of development that is considered within the typical boundaries. Note that typical development includes a plus or minus 6 months of the ages cited on this chart. As babies learn to make the sounds of the language of their culture, how these sounds appear is predictable. The sound steps offer a typical developmental sequence. First, babies make sounds in isolation. Then, those sounds become part of syllables. Next, sounds are articulated correctly in words, phrases, and sentences. And the developmental sequence results in correct articulation in connected or conversational speech. As children move up the sound steps and begin using sounds to form words, their speech should become increasingly understandable to those around them. At 18 months of age, family and caregivers should be able to understand about 25% of a child's speech. When children turn 2, that increases to about 50 to 75% of speech. And at 3 years old, children, of course, will make sound errors, but 75% or more of their speech should be understandable to family and caregivers. And a 4-year-old's speech should be mostly understood even by strangers. And then by 5 years old, while not all sounds are articulated correctly, children's speech should be understood in most situations by most learners. This chart shows the typical developmental progression of speech sounds by age. You can see that there are some sounds, blends, and even a phonogram that come in close to 7 years of age. Again, note that typical development includes plus or minus 6 months of the ages cited on this chart. This slide outlines some warning signs that should not be ignored. Children exhibiting these signs should be screened for possible developmental or language differences. A screening helps providers to decide if a full evaluation and maybe even services would be beneficial. The best place to start this process is the child's pediatric office. If by 3 to 4 months the child does not react to loud noises, doesn't turn head to sounds like a rattle or a bell, doesn't look at their caregiver's face or use their eyes to follow simple movements, if the child is not smiling or cooing or using their voice to gain attention for others, it's time to think about screening. This slide continues to list warning signs. So, if by 14 months the child does not produce a variety of vocal sounds or even any vocal sounds, if the child isn't spontaneously using 4 to 8 words and not using simple gestures, if the child does not follow simple commands like give or come or communicates mostly by crying, screening is warranted. If by 28 to 30 months the child has fewer than 200 words, relies mostly on yelling, crying, grunting, or incoherent utterances for communication, has even begun to lose some words, or is easily frustrated by communication exchanges, it's time to seek some help. Let's look specifically at hearing, since it plays such a large role in the development of spoken language. We tend to think of hearing as something that the ears do alone, but hearing is also a sensory processing task, meaning the brain plays a large role in hearing. After all, vocal speech is auditory input, and that auditory input is sensory input. This means the first steps of hearing are dependent upon the brain. A shift in attention takes place as the brain attends to speech sounds, which have to be located and isolated from all other sounds in the environment. Remember that from earlier? Then the ears and the auditory nerve take over. Sound waves are converted to electrical impulses and transmitted or sent along the auditory nerve to the brain. Then the brain processes the sounds to determine meaning. Then it formulates and enacts the expected response by sending the necessary electrical impulses to the mouth, the tongue, the lips, and the lungs to enact the muscle movements needed and the airflow that make the proper sounds in the right order to produce speech. When we observe the child's response, we say the child hears. And while the ears do convert and transmit sound, the vast majority of what we think of as hearing actually happens in the brain. So what does this mean for infants and toddlers? Well, the sensory processing systems of babies and toddlers are not yet integrated. They cannot quickly and efficiently process sensation of any kind, and that does include auditory input. Developmentally, their sensory processing systems are still a work in progress. An integrated sensory system easily detects and attends to sensation, such as auditory input from the ear. It efficiently processes that sensation and easily and efficiently formulates the expected response. So, if we want to provide input that matches the level of sensory processing that is typical for babies and toddlers, we have to make a few changes. This slide outlines a 3-step format that can be used with all children, but it is especially effective for children with late developing language. The first step is to model a phrase or a word that matches the child's MLU. Remember, mean length of utterance. So for example, you might model cup or want spoon during lunch. Sometimes making it a direct prompt by adding say to the model Say spoon, say cup, lets the child know that you expect a response. Providing a model means that children only have to imitate language rather than generate it on their own. Importantly, in step number 1, you are introducing the language needed in a specific situation within the context of that situation, and this builds receptive language. In step 2, you prompt children to talk by providing an indirect or a non-verbal prompt. Several examples are listed on the slide. You want to use this step when children can come up with needed words on their own. My general rule is to give 2 prompts, and if the child doesn't do it, doesn't speak, go back and provide a model. If there's still no response, just move on. That interaction is not wasted because the child is listening to your language, which builds the receptive vocabulary needed to produce speech, perhaps the next try. The third step is the stage of natural conversation. Talk with children, not at them. Ask questions and engage in child-centered conversations. The prompts are removed, but language usage is still monitored, and prompts or models can be added back in as needed. Wait time is a critical implementation tool for a sensory system that is not yet integrated. Waiting allows children time to process receptive language and formulate and deliver that expected response. You want to wait at least 5 seconds. Listen to how that sounds. Want cup. That's an uncomfortably long pause for most adults, and it takes practice and discipline to wait that long. But if you prompt again too soon, you start that sensory processing loop over again. And for some children, the time they need might be even longer. You want to observe to determine what an average wait time might be for each child. This is a common error I see adults making with our well-developed sensory processing systems. We process and formulate language in an instant, and we expect quick responses. But for language learners, this process requires more time. MLU, remember, is a measure of expressive language development, but it is also an indicator of receptive language ability. Since we know that receptive language ability exceeds expressive language ability, we can make our language chunks, or what we say, just a little longer than the child's. So if a child speaks in 3-word utterances on average, that child could comfortably process a 3 to 4-word utterance. Adults should speak in sentences that match or are just slightly longer than the child's MLU to ensure that optimal understanding and learning. Don't worry if your phrases and sentences are not quite grammatical. Remember, mastery of simple grammar comes when children produce sentences of 5 to 6 words during the 4th year of their life. As children's MLU grows, then ours will too, and eventually the language that you use becomes more and more normal. Let's take a look at a couple of examples. Say a child with an MLU of 3 is touching Ellie and she's getting upset. What should the adult say? Which one will be easier to understand? Is it the child's fault if instruction A is not followed? And is that child who doesn't follow instruction A demonstrating reactive or non-compliant behavior? I'd have to say no. And that's because instructions have to be understood to be followed. That's why matching MLU is important for any language learner, and that includes very young children. The most important tool for teaching language, of course, is your voice. You are the material. So how you use your voice is important. So one important tip is to slow your rate of speech down. Since a toddler's brain is not yet efficient at processing auditory information, speaking slowly gives the brain additional processing time. It tells the brain to slow down and reduces the chances that the brain will become overwhelmed, which can cause a behavioral outburst. Very young children will try to match the rate of their speech to yours as they imitate you, and slowing down makes that easier. Speaking slowly is also important when reading. Listen to my pace as I read a page from Everywhere Babies. Every day, everywhere, babies are born. Fat babies, thin babies, small babies, tall babies, winter and spring babies, summer and fall babies. Clearly, I was reading slowly. This pace is a better match for the toddler's sensory processing system, especially when it's a new book with new vocabulary. Showing pictures also needs to be done with care. When showing pictures to a group, do not move the book. Moving it means that the child has to visually track the picture with their head and eyes while also trying to process what they're looking at. Instead, hold that book still while part of the group looks. Then, after they're done looking and you can observe their visual attention and watch for a shift in their visual attention, you're going to see their eyes move when they're done looking. Then, that's your cue to move the book to the other side of the group or perhaps to begin reading again. The same is true for singing. Adults need to slow down. This is one of the most frequent mistakes, again, that I observe in toddler classrooms. Teachers just sing way too fast, and the little ones cannot keep up or sing along. So I'm going to sing a song for you. Sorry, you have to listen to me sing, but listen for the pace I'm singing at and watch for that embedded sign language of the word stop. I can clap, I can clap, I can clap and stop. I can clap, I can clap, I can clap and stop. I can clap, I can clap, I can clap and stop. I can clap, 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 clap. You'll know you're right when it's less of a concert and more of a sing-along. Another way to use your voice as a teaching tool is to add pauses and use vocal emphasis. That helps draw attention to important information and that cues the brain to attend. So, for example, imagine a child having real trouble with the button frame. You have represented over and over again, and the child just doesn't seem to be getting it. So you decide to add maybe a little bit of verbal instructions as a way to help. How you use vocal emphasis and pauses can highlight important information, making it easier for the child to pick out and process that important information. So saying, push the button places emphasis on the verb push, and the emphasis is then on what to do. Saying, push the button emphasizes the noun, the button, and that's what's highlighted. The same is true for the example of pulling the fabric listed on the slide. Let's talk a little bit about when children understand negation. Look at the image on the slide and try to find a child who does not have a train. Pretty easy, right? But children without complete understanding of negation are going to point to a child with a train every single time. Typically, developing children completely understand negation in sentences between the ages of 3 to 4. And likely it's going to be even later for children who experience developmental delays and for children who are multilingual learners. I know this feels late, but it's true. And it's true because negation comes in so many different forms. Just because a child can follow a negative command in one situation does not mean they can follow negative statements in all situations. It's hard for adults, and this leads to thoughts of, but I just told you not to do that. When I was a teacher in my first year, I was lucky enough to be paired with a lovely woman nearing retirement age. She was a child in the 1930s, and when she learned to do a cartwheel, she was really excited to show her favorite person in the world, her grandfather. And as she skipped outside to show him, he called after her, "Don't do it on the sidewalk." She heard "do it on the sidewalk," so she did, turned around triumphantly, and he was furious. He thought she had deliberately disobeyed him. And remember, it was the 1930s, so he spanked her. Even so many years later, telling me she had tears in her eyes at the thought of this moment of triumph for her turned into a moment of disappointment. The solution is to use positive phrasing whenever possible. Positive phrasing is a powerful tool for children of all ages. Positive phrasing means that negation is not part of your instruction or statement. It means you're telling children what to do rather than what not to do. And I think you can see that in the examples on the slide. Frankly, using positive phrasing makes a more pleasant classroom experience for everyone. Positive phrasing is instructive. You're telling children exactly what to do, and that increases their ability to follow instructions. It reduces the possibility of misunderstandings, and positive phrasing meets young language learners where they are developmentally. Using negative statement adds difficulty for little ones. It means that they have to translate a negative statement like "don't do it on the sidewalk" into a positive action like "do it on the grass." And that's a challenging task for toddlers who are still learning language. Positive statements definitely support receptive and expressive language development. That brings us to the end of today's presentation. Thank you so much for spending your time with me today. Before I let you go, I'm excited to announce my newest book, The Montessori Approach to Classroom-Based Interventions. This handbook is a reference tool. It is designed to help all adults, regardless of their knowledge, training, or experience with inclusive education or even Montessori education. It was written for adults searching for ways to support every child's developmental progress and learning. It holds answers to the most important question asked by adults invested in children's success. What do I do now? To offer answers, this book takes an innovative view of development. Chapters 2 through 5 focus on how differences in the ability to process specific sensory information, including auditory and visual information, affect learning and development. Chapters 6 through 9 explore the impact of other common developmental differences. Two of these are dedicated to the development of language and the articulation of speech sounds. The techniques I described in this presentation today and more are covered in more depth and with multiple examples to hopefully help bring them to life. Chapters 10 through 11 explore interventions for learners demonstrating what some call challenging behavior, but what I now refer to as reactive behavior. Each chapter follows the same format, including a simple definition, relevant characteristics, common concurrent diagnoses, developmental impacts, and a brief list of observable classroom behaviors. The majority of each chapter, however, is devoted to specific interventions that match the characteristics and needs of children experiencing uneven development, developmental delays, or even disabilities. This book is truly full of steps that detail exactly how to help. By the time you see this presentation, it should be available on Amazon and from Parent Child Press, a division of Montessori Services. Thank you again for joining me for today's presentation. I hope you learned a few things that will make it easier for you to begin supporting the language development of the little ones in your life. If you have any questions or concerns, please reach out to me. You can do it through the Childhood Potential website or at my contact information listed on this slide. And have a great rest of the conference.